Every victor who lives off European money while trying to sell out European interests deserves a smack upside the head.
Today we're diving deep into the escalating tensions between Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. This isn't a simple feud. It sits at the heart of a debate over EU enlargement, European unity, energy, war, and the very meaning of security in the 21st century. At first glance, the conflict seems straightforward. Ukraine seeks closer integration with the European Union and eventual membership. But behind the headlines, there's a complex web of political strategy, of domestic elections, fears over economic stability, deep disagreements on foreign policy, and the shadow of the war with Russia. This story speaks to how European leaders make decisions, how national interests clash with collective choices, and how one member, Hungary, can reshape the EU's entire agenda. Let's start first with what is happening right now. In the last week, Viktor Orban has publicly doubled down on his opposition to Ukraine joining the European Union. He's warned that expedited EU membership for Ukraine would have severe economic consequences, especially for Central European economies like Hungary's agriculture sector. His message is clear: Ukraine's accession is out of the question, whether on a fast track or any other path. Orban argues that EU funds that should be used for internal development would be diverted to Ukraine, creating a kind of bottomless financial burden on the Union. This is not a marginal position. It comes as Hungary prepares for a national election in April 2026, and Orban's party faces significant opposition after 16 years in power. Campaigning against Ukraine's EU bid has become part of his domestic strategy, tapping into widespread public skepticism in Hungary about deeper involvement in Ukraine's future. This approach has included launching a national petition against EU financial support for Ukraine. Orban has also accused Ukraine of interfering in Hungarian politics ahead of those elections. In a dramatic move, he summoned Ukraine's ambassador, claiming without evidence that Ukrainian leaders were trying to influence Hungary's electoral process. This is a striking escalation. Diplomatic relations between neighbours are normally grounded in careful negotiations, not public accusations of election meddling. These tensions are spilling over into broader European debates within the EU. On one side, you have the majority of member states supporting continued aid and a clear path toward Ukraine's membership. On the other, Hungary stands as a persistent blocker, insisting that accession criteria, risks, and economic costs must be considered before any further steps. The rules for full EU membership require unanimous approval from all member states, so even if 26 EU leaders agree, one alone can block progress. Orban has used this veto repeatedly to slow down or stall talks. This brings us to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's been a commanding figure on the world stage since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Zelensky argues that Ukraine's future lies in the European Union, not just for economic benefits, but for security, stability, and democratic identity. From public addresses in Brussels to quiet negotiations with EU leaders, his message remains the same. Ukraine wants to be part of Europe, and that means EU membership. Zelensky has called on Orban directly to stop blocking his country's EU bid. He says that Ukraine is doing the work needed to meet accession requirements, and that Hungary's resistance is based not on technical objections, but on political motives. According to some reports, Zelensky links Orban's stance to broader geopolitical positioning, where Orban aligns himself more closely with Russian interests or perspectives on the war. In response, Orban has intensified his rhetoric. He's warned that Ukraine's EU membership could drag the entire bloc into the ongoing war with Russia. He contends that if Ukraine becomes an EU member, the Union might be forced to defend Ukrainian territory under collective security clauses, potentially widening the conflict into a direct confrontation with Russia. He has also floated the idea of a strategic partnership instead of full membership, a relationship that would bring collaboration without full integration. It's worth noting that this isn't just political theatre. Many Central European leaders worry that rapid expansion of the EU to include a country at war would strain the bloc's capacity to manage economic recovery, internal cohesion, and political unity. But only some leaders express this concern through cautious negotiation. Others, like Orban, combine it with sharp diplomatic conflict and, at times, nationalist language that resonates domestically. Now here's where it gets even more complicated. While the European Commission has praised Ukraine for steady progress on reforms, including anti-corruption measures, it also warns that more work is needed. These technical benchmarks are part of the EU's enlargement framework. Progress on these benchmarks gives Ukraine some momentum in negotiations, even while Orban's political veto continues to block formal advancement. Meanwhile, Zelensky remains defiant. Even in public addresses last year, he stated confidently that Ukraine will join the European Union either with full consensus or by finding alternative paths if necessary. This reflects a broader debate within the EU about whether unanimous approval should remain the only path for enlargement, especially in cases deemed crucial for regional stability. All of this is happening against the backdrop of deepening tensions not just between capitals, but within EU institutions. Some EU leaders are frustrated by Hungary's repeated use of veto powers, particularly as the war in Ukraine now stretches into its third year, and the need for unity seems greater than ever. There are discussions in Brussels about how to handle persistent vetoes that block decisions supported by the wider membership. These debates reach beyond Ukraine to touch on the EU's internal rules and the balance of power among member states. If you want to understand modern European politics, this is where strategy, national interest, and international law intersect. These are not theoretical concerns. The decisions made today will define EU defence policy, budget allocations, and political alliances for a generation. Now let's pause to connect these developments to a larger historical perspective. The EU was once a union primarily of Western European democracies united after the devastation of World War II. Enlargement over the decades expanded that family to include countries across Central and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. But all previous enlargements were quieter, more incremental, and centered on agreed criteria for democratic norms, rule of law, human rights, and economic stability. Ukraine's accession bid has turned this process into a geopolitical battleground. It raises questions about what membership means during an active conflict and how sovereignty and democratic choice should be balanced against collective security responsibilities. In practical terms, the outcome of this debate will impact billions of euros in EU budgets, future EU foreign policy priorities, and the internal political dynamics of member states like Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, where domestic elections increasingly reflect broader EU tensions. Today, the EU is at a crossroads. On one hand, leaders like Zelensky push for integration and unity in the face of Russian aggression. On the other, leaders like Orban insist that security, economic stability, and public consent must guide every step, even if it means blocking the path for their neighbour. If you're following these developments closely or new to this story, now is the time to understand the implications. To keep up with the latest on Orban's position, Zelensky's responses, EU Council negotiations, and what this means for Ukraine's future, make sure you subscribe to EU Politics. We'll continue to break down every key moment, explain how European institutions respond, and explore what this conflict means not just for Brussels and Kiev, but for the future of European unity itself. Thanks for watching. Drop your thoughts in the comments and we'll dive into them in our next episode. Stay informed, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next update. Today, the EU is at a crossroads. On one hand, leaders like Zelensky push for integration and unity in the face of Russian aggression. On the other, leaders like Orban insist that security, economic stability, and public consent must guide every step, even if it means blocking the path for their neighbour. If you're following these developments closely or new to this story, now is the time to understand the implications. To keep up with the latest on Orban's position, Zelensky's responses, EU Council negotiations, and what this means for Ukraine's future, make sure you subscribe to EU Politics. Today, the EU is at a crossroads. On one hand, leaders like Zelensky push for integration and unity in the face of Russian aggression. On the other, leaders like Orban insist that security, economic stability, and public consent must guide every step, even if it means blocking the path for their neighbour. If you're following these developments closely or new to this story, now is the time to understand the implications. To keep up with the latest on Orban's position, Zelensky's responses, EU Council negotiations, and what this means for Ukraine's future, Make sure you subscribe to EU Politics.